Tim, if I may, first of all, welcome to Prague on behalf of the Havel Library. It is a great pleasure to have you here, and I am super excited to have you be my first guest in my capacity as the new director of the institution. Hard to imagine somebody else I'd rather talk to in this episode of the Havel Channel interview. So thank you for accepting the invitation. You get asked a lot of questions these days about Ukraine, about NATO, about Central Eastern Europe, about the upcoming presidential election. But today I'd like to talk to you about something else. Václav Havel, I imagine you do not get too many questions about him in the United States, perhaps not even around Europe. But that is what I would like to center this interview around. And I know that you are an Oxford alum, that you were there in the early 1990s, and that you were quite close to some of the people who were quite close to President Havel. Tim Garton-Ash was your doctoral thesis supervisor, if I remember correctly what you told me. And this was the period shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which he witnessed, I believe, in person, spent some time in Central Europe, wrote inside the Magic Lantern a book, a sort of an eyewitness account of the revolution. So I imagine that in the early 1990s, when he was supervising your thesis, he was quite full of these impressions. So my first question to you is, when did your initial encounter with Havel take place? Was it at Oxford? Was it through Timothy Garton-Ash? Or how did you discover Havel?
No, the order was the other way around. One of the reasons I wanted to go to Oxford was that I had the idea that I should study with Timothy Garton-Ash. And the reason I had that idea was that I had been reading his reportage from Czechoslovakia and East Germany and Poland in the New York Review of Books in the 1980s and the very early 1990s, 1990, 1991. I came to Oxford in the fall of 1991. So the sequence is the other way around. It was rather that I was interested in Havel, and I was interested in Havel in part because of what Tim Garton-Ash wrote in the books to which you refer, especially The Uses of Adversity, were first articles, and I was reading the articles at the time. So I had my first ideas about Havel came from reading Havel in English, in translation, and then so I had an idea of him as a thinker. And then I had the idea of him as a person indirectly by way of Tim Garton-Ash before I went to graduate school.
So is my understanding correct that you came across him even before the end of the Cold War, while you were an undergraduate at Brown?
Yes, of course. I mean, he was not an unknown figure. There were, in my little universe of East European thinkers, before I learned the languages, the two most important, and I think it's fair to say the two who broke through a bit into the wider world by the late 1980s were Václav Havel and Adam Michnik. So these were already everyday. These are people who were present in my life before I became an East Europeanist. Yes.
What were the initial works, the first works that you encountered? Havel, of course, wore many hats. He was a playwright. He was an essayist. Did you discover him through his essays, his letters to Dubček or Husak, through The Power of the Powerless, or was it his plays, perhaps?
No, the plays came later. I only really appreciated the plays later. I thought of Havel first as a political thinker, and the key text was Power of the Powerless, which in translation by Paul Wilson. So no, it was very straightforward. I mean, the texts that I write about in the new book on freedom are the texts that mattered to me back then, which were The Letter to Husak from 1975 and Power the Powerless, which was written in 78 and published first in Polish in 79 and then in Czech later in 79, I believe. But the political texts, The Letter to Husak and Power the Powerless, were the ones from which I got the concepts which got me started thinking a little bit about the way that one might oppose the system around one without directly opposing the political system.
What were your initial responses to Havel? So here you are at Brown as an undergraduate, stumbling across The Power of the Powerless and some of his other writing, his letter to Husak, his way to, or his thinking about how protest can be engendered, right?
Yeah. I mean, these are hard questions. I'm going to do my best to answer honestly, but
I apologize.
It's we all have a tendency to accumulate memories one on top of the other, and of course it's the ones which are more recent than which are the top layer, and we all have a tendency as well to try to make the past more coherent than in fact it was, and to sound smarter than in fact we were at the time. And so when you ask me questions like this, I have to try to resist that. It's the thing which interested me, I think it's fair to say, in the late 1980s, was the idea that individual choices had some kind of political sense. So in the tradition in which I was raised or educated in the United States, individual moral choices were insignificant. What mattered were choices about interests. So you like red apples and not yellow apples, therefore you're doing your part to provide information to the market so we can all be happy. You are, you have an interest in deregulation because you own a big company, therefore you vote for this candidate rather than that candidate. But so whether we're talking about whether we're talking about personal choices as economic choices or political choices as economic choices, it all really came down to economic choices, and no one was really asking you to perform any sort of ethical role. The notion was that either the magic of the marketplace or the magic of Americans' exceptional constitutional institutions dreamed up by the demigods who were the founders of our country. Either way, there was some kind of magic which was going to convert behaving according to interests into some kind of larger order, which was good. And so that's, if you're created within that tradition, then the idea that it matters whether you hang a sign in your window or not, that it matters whether you complain about the quality of the beer or not, the idea that individuals have quirky, irreducibly personal commitments, and that these have some kind of political significance. That's what was interesting. I think that's what spoke to me as a teenager or as a very young person, because of course, if you're in this world where only interests matter, then your rebellion against it is going to say, well, it's not interests, it's feelings or it's emotions. And in some way, what Havel does is he provides a bridge, because Havel says, well, it's not emotions, you actually have moral commitments in there somewhere. So even rock and roll can be a moral commitment, for example, right? It's not just a feeling, it's not just a surge of neurological energy. It can be, as Havel writes, I mean, the rock and roll can be a form of freedom, right? And so these things, it's not emotion against interest, it's rather that the things you really care about are significant morally, and that they can also be significant politically if you choose to affirm them. That, I think, was what was interesting to me as a young person.
I find that very interesting. It certainly resonates with my experience in the United States in the mid-1990s, except I came at it from the other direction. Coming from this discourse, this Havelian discourse, I was 10 when the wall came down and when he became president. So coming to the United States, enrolling at an American college, the language of preferences, consumer preferences, rational choice was everywhere, and not just in introductions to economic theory, but also in political philosophy. And I found that very sort of shallow, so to speak, lacking the sort of depth that I was coming from, having heard everything Havel had to say after being elected as president, starting to read him, and so on. Very interesting. Have you met him in person?
Yes, but only very casually. There was no significant
interaction. In what context was this? While he was still president, or
no? It's a conference. A conference in Bratislava.
How is his current reception in the United States? I mean, do you, in your classes, for example, at Yale University, is he on your reading lists? Do you engage students about Havel? Do they bring him up themselves?
So his reception in the United States and do I teach him are
those are two different questions, correct?
So only very distantly related questions.
First we can chat about Yale University and the sort of the environment in which you work, or the circumstances, the sort of the intellectual circumstances, and then perhaps broader in the United States. Although once again, my experience is after a couple of decades teaching at liberal colleges in the United States, I really have not come across him too much.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I have a friend, the philosopher Jason Stanley, who teaches at the philosophy department at Yale, and he jokes that all of the Yale undergraduates walk around quoting Havel, and he means it. I mean, he means it. He means it sarcastically, like perhaps maybe this is a little strange, and it's unusual. So at Yale, Marcy Shore teaches Havel in her course on the history of thought from Nietzsche to the present, in a continuity which involves the history of phenomenology. I teach fragments of his essays in my survey class on East European history in the 20th century. And then I have also taught a couple of times a graduate seminar or a seminar on mass incarceration in the Soviet Union and the United States. That's the title of the class, in which I assign Havel's Power of the Powerless. Essentially, well, partly there's the interesting fact that Havel released a lot of the prisoners after he was elected president, which is a historical fact which I think largely goes forgotten, but also because Havel is about alertness to the ways in which you're responsible that you may not in everyday life attend to. And then I wrote a book. I was writing for several years a book about freedom, which is now done. And while I was writing that book, I taught a class in a maximum security American prison, in which Havel was also on the reading list as a thinker about freedom. So yes, I mean, I've been teaching Havel at Yale for since 2001 in one sort of class or another. And Marcy Shore teaches Havel, and so there are people at Yale are quite familiar with Havel. But beyond that, it's very hard to think. I mean, partly it has to do. I mean, it's overdetermined because the humanities in general are on the decline, and insofar as philosophy departments still thrive, they're in an analytical tradition where this sort of thought doesn't have much of a place. And then, beyond that, Americans move on from from one thing to another, one fashion to another, very, very quickly. So.
Nonetheless, do you find anything that we could call timeless in Havel that might serve us well into the future? I'm sure that some of his writings are very context-bound, tied to the circumstances that existed at the time they were written. But what if anything, do you find timeless in his work?
Well, in fact, I actually, over time, find them more broadly applicable than I did when I was younger. I mean, I answered your question about reading him as a teenager in the broadest possible way, but for the most part, when I'm in my 20s or 30s, I'm reading him as an East European who is responding to a specific East European predicament. As the text age and as I age, I actually find the arguments more broadly applicable. And not just the arguments. Before I get to the arguments, I want to say something about the writing. It's the concreteness of the writing is very important. So Havel is sometimes operating with abstract language that might seem unfamiliar to people who are outside a tradition of Husserl or Patočka. But very often he's presenting you with very specific daily conjunctures. So for example, in The Power of the Powerless, the greengrocer who does or does not hang a sign in his window, that image is very accessible to people. So for example, when I was teaching Power of the Powerless in spring 2002 in a seminar on East European intellectual history, I had a Pakistani student who talked about how her parents, so spring of 2002 in the United States is a few months after the terrorist attacks of September 11th. So she was talking about how her parents wore American flag lapels because they were afraid of what it would be like if they didn't. And of course, that was an application of this image in what at first seems to be a very, very different context. But of course, if you think about it a step longer, if you take a beat longer to think about it, the conformism is quite similar. And the effects are also quite similar. And I too, at that time, found myself allergic to those flag lapel pens. And I thought, well, once we put these things on our jackets, we're never going to be able to take them off. And now it's almost a quarter century later, and American politicians still can't take the flag lapel pens off their jackets, right? And it's not patriotism. It's not individualism, it's not freedom, it's none of those things. It's conformism and fear of what would happen if they took the flag pen off. So the images are very important, and that's truer still when one digs into the plays. So Audience, for example, is full of scenes which people can identify with outside of the context. But the ideas for me have become, as I say, more generally applicable, especially with respect to the concept of predictability. That there was an aspect to Havel which I didn't really understand in the 1980s and early 1990s, which was the criticism of technology. And the argument that in terms of technology, the East and the West were actually two variants of a broader problem. So going back to the point about how it's important to be honest about how dumb you used to be in the past. At the time, I just simply did not understand that, and I dismissed it. That language seemed to me to be confused and nonsensical. How on earth was the West and the democratic West a variant of the same problem of normalized Czechoslovak communism? I didn't get that. But now in the post-2010 age of social media, I've gone back to that because I think he was really on to something with his idea of the most probable states, and that a way that we can be ruled without convictions, without faith, is that we can be guided into our most probable states by people or by entities who understand those states better than we are, who have more data than we do. That insight that we can be ruled by, as it were, the laws of probability, that we can become more predictable, that we can become more like pieces moved around the table because our motions become predictable to those who are watching the game. That idea, I think, only now is hitting home because it's been literalized in the way that we interact with social media. So in the book on freedom, in which Havel is one of the 5 main thinkers, it's that notion of predictability and unpredictability which is most important. And I believe that's something which clearly goes beyond the context. I mean, Havel has in mind things like television, television, and we're in a different technological world, but I think he quite rightly anticipated the problem, right? For Havel, it was like, we're predictable because at 7:30, we're all watching the same television show. We're now at a much higher level of predictability and what I think of as predictifying, that we're made more predictable, or to use Havel's language, that we are moved into our more probable states. And again, because Havel was a metaphysician, he was thinking of our more probable states as our worst states. And this is interesting too, that there's a judgment being made here. The thing which is most probable about us, that we are intolerant, that we're impatient, that we fear the new. This is the thing which the internet can pick up and can amplify. The things which are best about us, says Havel, are the things which are unpredictable, authentic, the things which cut against what's going on, the things which are new, and those are the things which are suppressed.
He certainly would have a lot to say about social media and the way social media sort of dig us into our own echo chambers or probable states and get rid of the quirks and idiosyncrasies. And I think you're quite right that he does address himself not just to Czechoslovakia under normalization, but to perhaps Western consumer society and perhaps even more broadly to modernity, rationalism, and so on. Why should we keep reading Havel? Do you think, and this goes back to, actually you are a very perceptive reader, of course. You're familiar even with things that frequently elude readers of Havel here, his notion of a secret life of society and how important it is. What is the state of this secret life of society, let's say, in the United States today? Could society die in that way or figure of speech? Would that death be irreversible? Is there a way to come back from it?
It's so to answer your first question, there are a few thinkers who I read over and over again because I always find something new, or they speak to me in a different way over time. And Hannah Arendt is one. Actually, Orwell is one for me too. It's not each time I read 1984, it's not the same book as it was the time before. But Havel par excellence is one of those thinkers that I would, if you read Power of the Powerless, I mean, I read Power of the Powerless every year or two because I'm teaching it, but if you read it every few years, it appears to be a different text. The emphases appear to be in different places. The main argument appears to be different. And that's a sort of generic argument for continuing to read Havel, that it's not the kind of thing that you memorize when you're young and then you recite when you're old. It actually seems to mean different things over time because there's a density in it, there's a richness to it. As far as the secret life of society, there's a beauty to that term, to that concept, because it's not secret in the sense of conspiratorial. It's secret in the sense that it's ineffable. It's difficult to describe exactly why it is that people like the things that they do. So there's a meaning in an encounter between two people who are enthusiastic of about the same thing, which can't necessarily be shared in words by other people. It only exists in their encounter or in the thing, whatever that thing is. And as Havel insistently reminds us, the thing itself doesn't have to be elite or glamorous. It can be something which is relatively simple or straightforward, but it just happens to be what we really care about. And so the secret has to do with our love for things, and the love that people have for each other, which is related to those things. By things, I don't mean objects. I mean subject of our interest or authentic concern. And there is certainly, when I think of the contemporary United States, honestly, when I compare it to Europe, it's time that we don't have. It's very hard to be a person who has those quirky human interests when the way you're supposed to live is go to school, go into debt, get a job, pay off the debt, have children, go into credit card debt, continue to work. And when there's no real notion that as a human you should have time. We don't really have that in the US. It goes along with what I was saying about being a teenager. If all we have are preferences, it doesn't take any time to express a preference. You just go to the store, or now you just order on Amazon. You've expressed your preference. You don't need time for that. What do you need time for? So we have no notion that a human, especially an adult human, should have time, and therefore it's very hard for those, whatever those mysterious yearnings might be, for them to find an outlet, or for them to find a partner, for them to find somebody else. And the other part of it, of course, is that what you're interested in, if you do have some kind of quirky interest, you're probably exposing it on the internet. And then on the internet, it's going to get categorized into something else. And you're going to be grouped immediately with other people who will have something generically in common with you, and then your perhaps quirky personal interest will be eroded, sanded. It will be moved so that it fits into that drawer, so that you can then be exposed to the correct advertisements of other people who are in that drawer. And that it's not that fails. I think it probably works, but what it does is that it makes us less interesting. Right, and even the way that you're interested in something, like we're not all interested in sports in the same way. Like sports is a generic thing that many Americans are interested in, that people are interested in different ways, but they will now be grouped according to the sport and professional or amateur and the region and so on, and then they'll be given the appropriate advertisements. So of course it can be extinguished, and I worry a lot about this. For the last 8 years or so, I spent a lot of time talking to Americans who are in despair about their politics. And an underlying theme is I can't really find a way to express my concern. And that's because their concern comes from who they are, like their sense of how things ought to be. And there's no real form in which they've learned how to express that. And so when people are against Trump, what they do is at best, they find a way to say what they're against, but they're not very good at saying what they're for. And this is part of the problem of The Secret Life of Society, right? That there are 330 million different ways of living in the United States, but there aren't that many ways of articulating how to live in the United States. And so when you face a crisis, you're not good at saying what you're going to miss.
Or perhaps there is no language to express that conceptual vocabulary and so on. Havel as a way to resist the pressures that turn us into automatons that Orwell or Zamyatin in his We described. Tim, thank you very much for this interview. It was a great pleasure. Perhaps you've just made an argument to move to Europe and stay here indefinitely.
Well, I'm very glad to visit with you, and I wish you all the best in your new responsibilities.
Thank you very much.